Okay, good evening, everybody. Go ahead and get started tonight. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover. I want to make sure we get through. So, as is our custom, I want to take just a minute to look back at what we talked about last week. If you recall, we spent the majority of our week on David and Abigail and the story that goes along with that. We talked a little bit about, first off, David and Nabal, who was a wealthy landowner there at the time. His wife was Abigail. David tried to get him to pay him a little bit for some of his services. Nabal refused, and David took that personally. Wanted to kill him. His wife Abigail kind of approached David and calmed him down a little bit, and allowed Nabal to live. And we kind of talked a little bit about how we want you to think about in your life, how do we respond when God provides counsel to us, maybe in people that we don't even know about. It doesn't have to be that someone talks us out of committing some kind of heinous act or anything like that, but it's just, something about, there are people that God puts in our lives for a reason. And always be thankful for that and be watching out for that. But then at the end of our class, we talked about how David spared Saul's life again, where they were sleeping in the camp, if you remember, and David went and stole his spear and the water jug, went across the mountains there and called out to Saul and said, "Hey, I could have killed you. What's the deal?" Saul, again, he kind of repents, says, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I realize." But all through this, we talked again about how God is trustworthy, that God looks out for those who look to Him, and we're going to talk a little bit about that even more tonight. That's kind of been the whole theme of David's life up to this point, is when he's turned back to God, God has taken care of him, and God is trustworthy. But the problem is, trusting God is difficult, even for David, I think, and we're going to see some of that in the next few weeks. We're going to see a more human side of David than we have seen in times. Now that he's gonna, next week, I guess, we're gonna talk a little bit about, sorry, I worked on it yesterday. We're gonna talk a little bit about when he becomes king and some of that. So we think about that, and that God will provide for us. Again, we may not realize at the moment what God is doing for us, but He's always in the back, working, kind of thinking, planning ahead for us, and God's plan will be the most important thing in our lives, to follow that. Did anybody have any thoughts about lesson 5 last week before we move on? Any other comments? I'll kind of recap that quickly, but all right, we're going to be in chapter 27. We're going to start out in chapter 27. If someone would read the first 4 verses of chapter 27, 1 Samuel, please.
Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Moab, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, and he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, and Nahum of Jezreel, and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he had no longer sought him.
All right. Do you mind to reread that very first phrase for me, verse 1? Again.
Then David said in his heart.
Uh-oh. That's his first problem, all right? Okay? He's not listening. He's not talking to God. That's his first problem in all of this. It's going to start out a series of things. He's saying it to himself, I got to do this. I've got to do this. I've got to run from Saul. I'm going to perish from Saul one day, even though God has clearly shown him up to this point that that's not the case, okay? So he says that, and that's obviously an issue. And you're going to also think about, we don't see, to my knowledge, we don't see any Psalms that are attributed to this period of time that we're talking about here, which means he's really not focused on that relationship with God. And that's going to kind of be the theme of what happens here towards the end of this book. And, he's kind of done his own thing a couple of times up to this point, and that really hasn't gone the way that he wanted it to go. And then he's turned back to God, and he will continue to do that. But the lesson for us there is, again, God should be our first thought. Think again about when he talked to Goliath. The first thing he said was, God is going to deliver us. He's going to deliver this Philistine into our hands. I mean, he immediately went to God, and he's not really doing that right now. So he is in a little bit of depression mode here at the beginning of this chapter, and he flees to Gath. And remember, we talked about who was from Gath. I just mentioned his name. Goliath. Okay, so this is the land of the Philistines, and he's going basically. He's run back there before. This is not the first time he's done that. But he even says, I'm going there to get away from Saul. Right. So he feels like he's going to die from Saul, even though he's protected him all these times. And so he stays with Achish for about 16 months, and he actually fights for him. And I put for in parentheses. All right, he fights for him because he's going to tell Achish that he's fighting for him. And he's going to mention some places. I'm going to skip a little bit the rest of the chapter. But David says, if I found favor in your eyes, verse 5, let me have a place. So he gives them the Ziklag. David then goes up and fights. He fights the Geshurites, the Gerzites, the Amalekites. And he's basically telling, Achish will say, where have you fought today? And he'll tell him, but he's really, the thing about this that's interesting is some of the places that he's fighting are not really enemies of the Philistines at this point. And so it's kind of like, why would you be fighting those people? And in the back of David's mind, I think he's, one, running away from Saul, but he's also kind of thinking about his kingdom at the same time, what he's going to do when he becomes king. But really, he's fleeing from Saul. And if you see, as David read in verse 4, and when Saul was told that David had fled there, Saul no longer sought him. So it works, essentially, what he wants to do. He wants to get away from Saul, and he's done that. So that's where he is. But we see this kind of dual nature of David, where he's fighting for Achish because he wants to get away from Saul, but he's not really doing what Achish wants him to do, and he's kind of being deceptive about what he wants to do. And it says in verse 12 of this chapter, the last verse, and Achish trusted David, thinking he has made himself an utter stench to his people in Israel. Therefore, he will always be my servant. So Achish is basically saying, okay, I've got him now. He's not going to be able to go back to Israel because he's fighting for the Philistines. They're not going to like that, But he's not really doing that. So that's why it's the way it's going to work for God. So in that way, anybody have any thoughts about what's happening here? Anybody kind of dig into what David's got going on here? It's not a big chapter, but there's a lot going on.
I think it's very important to realize we kind of skipped over it, but in verse 9, and David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and garments, and come back to Achish. He brought Achish all the plunders, and while he was not plundering Israelites, although Achish thought he was.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah.
So Achish thought that he definitely had David
right
in the palm of his hand,
yeah.
because he thought that David was destroying his own people and he could never return back there.
Right.
And actually, the strategy that David's using here is not a bad strategy.
Yeah.
It's not God-driven,
Right.
but his strategy, he's hiding in plain sight of the enemy.
Yep.
Is what he's doing from Saul's perspective.
Right.
Because Saul's not going to go into this area.
Yeah.
Or he's afraid to, I should say.
Right. That's very true. Yeah. That's like I said, it worked. When he wanted to get away from Saul, and it worked. And he also has some other motives that he can use that'll help him here in a little bit.
He's also clearing out all of Israel.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
He's clearing
He's
out
laying the groundwork.
Yeah, he's laying the foundations for his kingdom.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to skip chapter 28 for now. We're going to come back to that, I promise. All right. It just doesn't really fit with the storyline for continuity. So we're going to skip chapter 28. We're going to move into chapter 29. And it's not a very long chapter as well. The Philistines basically here, they're at Aphek, and the Israelites are in Jezreel. So for those of you that like to, are visual people, this is kind of what I've got. You can see the Philistines are at Aphek in the middle, right? And the Israelites are in Jezreel, okay? And so the Philistines kind of discover what's going on, what David's doing with these armies, all right? And so they go to Achish and they say, we don't want to fight with David, all right? Because he's not really doing what you say he's doing. But they basically tell Achish, no, we don't want to fight with David. Because we know what he's done, he's killed Goliath and all of this. And so Achish then kind of goes back to David, hey, what's going on? I thought you said you were doing this, this, and this. And David, and again, I put it in parentheses, he pleads to continue, although it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. He doesn't really care whether Achish, because he's not really fighting for him. So he just kind of, this is in, down to back to verse 3 is when they say, what are these Hebrews doing here? Is this not David? And so then they were angry with him, verse 4. And so in verse 6 is when Achish calls David. And he says, as the Lord lives, which who knows if he's really worshiping the Lord, but David's Lord. You have been honest to me in what seems right. He's kind of like saying, have you been honest? You have been honest, right? You've told me the truth. And, and then David in verse 8, he says, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered until now that I may not go and fight? And says, again, he says in verse 9, I know that you're blameless in my sight. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to battle. So again, they just flat do not allow him to go up into battle. All right, and again, we talked a little bit about this because this is really all, again, part of God's plan. Because as we said, if he really goes up and fights with the Philistines, Israel's not going to accept him as their king, like David said. They're not going to. Achish thinks they're not going to accept him, but he's not really been doing that. So if he had gone up to fight with him, that would have posed a problem later when it was time for him to become king of Israel. Because they wouldn't have liked that he went up and fight with them. So, again, that was the question that I have here. So that kind of gets us through 29. Does anybody have any thoughts about where we're at so far? How David's kind of backfilling his battles here and seeing where he's at? All right, into chapter 30. I'm going to slow down a little bit here and cover some things. So, let's somebody read the first 6 verses of chapter 30, please.
Verse 6?
1 to 6, please. 1 through 6, please.
Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was burned with fire, and their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept, until they had no more power to weep. And David's 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal from Carmelite, the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God.
All right. So a little interesting situation here, okay? So right off the bat here, it says the Amalekites make a raid, right? And they take this Ziklag, which is where David and all his wives and all his men were staying. And they take the wives captive and all their, the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one. That's important to say. They killed no one, but carried it off and they went their way. that probably again is God's providence, because David would have just, as Hagar has pointed out several times, David would have just wiped them out, annihilated them probably. That's his general MO. But the Amalekites don't do that here, and we'll see why here in a little bit. But, again, so now the men, they weep until they have no more strength to weep, right? And that's going to come in here and back in just a second too. So they're greatly distressed, and if you're one of David's men, how are you feeling right about now? Okay, you've devoted your life to David, you followed him, and now your wives and your possessions just got taken captive. All right, so they're obviously a little distressed and not really doing what they are upset, and they're talking of stoning him. Would someone read verses 6 again and then add verse 7, please?
And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David.
All right. So what we see here is a little different than the way we started out the class, okay? David is now, he says at the end of verse 6, but David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. All right, and then it talks about talking to the priest and bringing the ephod. In other words, he's consulting priests and trying to get close to God in these two verses. And I think that's important for us to remember. He's, he found his strength in the Lord. He's in a bad way here. Okay, he's about to be stoned by his own people, because his places got captured. So he gains his strength from the Lord. He turns back to him. And again, I think we see that cycle with David. I think that's important. And so David now, because of this turning back, he asks God, he inquires of God, verse 8, all right, shall I go up? Shall I pursue after these people? David says yes, or God says yes, pursue, and you'll overtake. So God tells him to go. Now note, because they were so exhausted from their weeping and wailing, only 400 of the 600 men of David go up and help this fight. Okay, that's going to come back here in a little bit. We'll see that later on. Okay. All right. So we get down to verse 11. After God tells David to go out, the 200 stay behind. They take out, and in verse 11 they kind of come upon this little sickly Amalekite. All right, that's been left for dead by these raiders. The raiders that took all their stuff. This guy, he's left for dead, basically. Verse 11. David gives him something to drink. Basically, tells them, hey, where do you belong? Where are you from? He tells them who he is. He's an Amalekite. And David says, okay, all right, I got my little, carrot and a stick here. All right, so I got somebody that's going to lead me back to where they are. All right, the guy basically, he realizes he was left for dead, and David took care of him, protected him. So he basically says, okay, just don't kill me, So and if you don't kill me, I'll show you where everything's at. I'll show you where the Amalekites are at. So that gets us into verse 15 through 15. All right, so then in verse 16, the Amalekites here, they're having a party with their spoils. Okay, they're really and they've taken these things, but again, they didn't kill anybody. Okay, so they're partying a little bit. And in verse 17, David attacks, all right, and recovers everything. All right. So nothing was lost at all from what had been taken from them, and I think that's important for us to understand that David was able to do that. Nothing was missing, whether small or great. Verse 19, sons and daughters, spoils, everything, and he captured all the flocks. And people drove the livestock before him, and all that. Okay. So what I want to the lesson I want to kind of take from this here is that, David, and again, we've talked about this already, but, the whole point of this lesson, this whole class, is to try to draw some lessons from David. He's far from perfect, all right? And we've seen that already, and we're really going to see that in a couple of weeks, where he's not a perfect man, but when things go bad, he has a propensity to turn back to God. And when he does that, good things happen. When he does not, things don't go well, kind of like Saul. It didn't happen for him. So again, you kind of be thinking, okay, well, David's got to be thinking, okay, every time I turn back to God, I'm able to achieve this. I'm able to go back and do this. And so at some point you got to think, okay, he realizes that God is helping him here. All right. Would someone read verses 23 and 24 of chapter 30 for me, please?
David said, "You shall not do so, my brothers, and what the Lord has given us, he has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike."
All right. So what I think is important there is, again, we came back to the 200 that stayed behind, all right, because they were too tired and all that. Well, the 400 that went said, okay, well, we'll divide up the spoils amongst the 400 of us that went. We'll all be on our way. David says, no, we're going to divide it amongst the 600 of us. And the 400 are like, no. They didn't go with us. They didn't fight with us. And David is basically telling them, no, we're sharing this together. And so we stayed. And so I wanted us to make a point here, about the church. And I think that the reason I think of the church is all of us have different talents. And all of us have things that we do well and that we can help the church grow. And the church succeeds as a whole. Okay, we don't, we have to have, it's just like the Bible tells us, if everyone were the eye of the body, how would we hear? If everyone were the ears, how would we see? So everybody has a part. So think about your role in the church. And think about, we all share that same reward. If the church does well, we all do well too. And so, as part of David's men, these people get to share in that as well. And so I thought about that. Maybe I was reaching, but that's what I came up with. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I think that's a good point, and I think it's also a good point to realize that it's the same with our eternal reward that we get with our salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Some people can be quite frustrated because a believer that's on his that's on their deathbed and they're baptized right before they pass away, well, they get to share in that glory too.
Right.
And I think it's important that we realize that.
Yep. I agree. Okay. I want to kind of combine chapter 28 and 31. So we're going to go back to 28 like I promised. We're going to spend a little bit of time here. All right. So if someone would real quick, before we get into 28, if someone would read chapter 26, verse 21, please. Chapter 26, verse 21.
And Saul said, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Indeed, I have played a fool and erred exceedingly.
All right, so to me, if there was ever something that should go on Saul's tombstone, it's this right here. All right, he said it over and over and over. I'm sorry, I messed up, I made a mistake. But so we're going to see this kind of demise here of Saul. And to me, that verse just kind of encapsulates his entire life. And it's going to come to a head here. So would someone read verses 3 through 7 of chapter 28, please?
Now Samuel had died, and all of Israel had mourned for him, and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shuman. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. How far do you want me to go? 7?
7, please. Yeah.
When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, Behold, there is a medium at Endor. Okay,
so what's happened here is Saul, and one of the good things I guess he did is he actually got the mediums, in other words, people that our go-between between the living and the dead, the necromancers. He had thrown all of them out because of this witchcraft. And so now Saul says, okay, I'm trying to fight here. He saw the army of the Philistines. He was afraid, and he inquires of the Lord, verse 6. But the Lord did not answer him. Okay, and it's kind of like, well, duh, you haven't really been following me all along, so why would I answer you? So now he's really afraid. He doesn't know what to do because God won't answer him. God won't talk to him. So he goes against everything that he's wanted to do up to this point and consults this witch, all right, here at Endor. That gets us to verse 7. So, again, I think that's another lesson for us in that Saul, you can remove sin from your lives just on the face, but if you don't really take it out of your heart completely, like Saul did, he may have said, okay, hey, you shouldn't be here, you shouldn't be doing this witchcraft, but when push came to shove and he needed help, he just went back on what he had done. And so for in our lives, do we fully get rid of sin in our lives? I think that's important for us to understand. So as you get into the next paragraph here, 8 through 14 or so, they go to this woman and she says, surely you know what Saul has done, verse 9. So then why are you laying a trap for her? So she kind of knows, she thinks this is a trap, okay? Which, if she's a fortune teller or a witchcraft, I guess she should have already known that, but that's an whole other story, I guess. But anyway, so she says, Saul says, okay, surely no punishment will come for you. He asked her to bring up Samuel, okay, because Samuel was the one that anointed Saul. So again, God is not answering Saul here, and so Saul doesn't know what to do. Samuel has already died, remember, chapter 25. He's dead. And so Saul needs to talk to somebody. He needs some counsel. All right? So when this woman brings up Saul, so to speak, verse 15 through 19, Samuel is basically talking to Saul, like, why have you disturbed me? And Saul tells him, hey, I'm sorry to do this, but, God has stopped talking to me and I need some help, And again, Samuel's like, well, of course he stopped talking to you because you turned away from him. He basically tells Samuel through verses 19, because you didn't obey God, because you didn't do what you're told, all these things are happening to you. And it's going to happen, your end is coming just like it was prophesied all these times, just like I told you when I was alive, okay? That you are going to die, okay? And so Samuel's obviously frustrated here, and so he basically tells Saul, look, that's it, okay? It's over. All right, your reign is going to come to an end sooner rather than later. Your whole household is going to die. And again, it's not exactly that's the phrase that's used there. It's not everyone's going to die, and we'll talk about that in a second, okay? But so from verse 20 to the end of the chapter here, when Samuel tells him this, all right, then he being Saul, falls face down on the ground, all right, and he's filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And so he's out of strength. The witch, tries to tell him to eat. His men try to tell him to eat. Finally, he does, and he goes his way there. So he has consulted this witch, and he knows now, that's the way things are going to end. Joe.
Are you going to get to verse 19 at all?
Go ahead and read it.
Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me.
Okay, so you thinking heaven?
It's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, it's disturbing. But are you trying to talk about like where they spending eternity, or?
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is a New King James. If it's just a
wording
problem, if this is a problem with the languages, or is he saying is he's going to be with me, or are you going to be like I am, which is dead?
Yeah,
I would say dead.
That's
The place of the departed spirits.
Yeah, in second Samuel chapter 12, David's going to say that,
He's going to be in the place of the departed spirits. He's going to be in the Hadean realm.
which I guess would be, we talked a little bit about like Sheol. I think we talked about when Ken had his class, which is the place of the dead. I think that we're talking about here. In such cases like that, there's not really a distinction between the wicked and at that point in time. So I think that's kind of maybe what we're talking about here. That's my quick interpretation. I haven't had a chance to study it, but I can
Oh,
take
we need to go to this deeper.
it. No time.
I mean, they're rolling their sins forward, right, with the offerings.
Somebody's putting some money in the plate. Oh, I got you. I've never heard of rolling
Next.
forward, but yes.
You're filling in for your dad. All right. So now we go into into chapter 31. All right, we skip over what we talked about, 29 and 30. Okay, and we're back to this. That's after David's goes to the Amalekites. So then we see in verse 31, which is the last chapter. All right. So the Philistines fought hard against Israel, and this is the fight that basically Samuel was talking about. All right, and in verse 2, it just kind of lays it out there. All right, and the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. So Jonathan, our beloved friend of David here, dies. All right, and from what I can tell, it would appear that Saul likely watched his sons die right in front of him. Okay, a couple will survive, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. You may remember Mephibosheth. We'll talk about him in a couple chapters, and Ishbosheth. He'll come up next week. So, but Saul was wounded. Okay, but he doesn't want to be tortured or made an example of here. All right, in the first part, the battle pressed hard against Saul. Archers found him. Verse 3. Badly wounded him. So he asked his armor bearer, who's with him there, to kill him so that he's not humiliated. And his armor bearer is like, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay, because the penalty for him killing Saul would have been his death anyway. He would have died because he killed Saul if they found that out. So unfortunately, he says, his armor bearer doesn't do that. Then Saul kills himself, and the armor bearer then kills himself. So I don't really know what the point of all that was, but the armor bearer ends up killing himself as well when he sees that Saul is dead.
Well, the armor bearer that's your personal bodyguard, pretty much.
Yeah.
And the fact that you just let your king get killed, or kill himself, I should say.
Yeah.
That doesn't really look too good on you.
Yeah. Yep. So Saul is dead. All right, his armor bearer is dead. His sons are dead, all up on this mountain. All right, so any thoughts up through verse 7? It's kind of quick to talk about that, but the fight, the Philistines finally got to Saul, and so he is dead. Then you get to, sorry, I didn't catch up here. All right, so you get to verse 8 and following. The Philistines, then they kind of sack the cities, and they start to live in these cities that are now been abandoned by the Israelites. Okay, and they're residing in these cities. Okay, and then verse 9. All right, so Saul is decapitated. All right, and then they take his head and all that and proclaim victory all around. They take his body to Beth Shan, where it's desecrated, put up in the temple, and all of that. And then in verse 11. All right, it says that the valiant men of Jabesh Gilead, which we started past this point, but if you want to go back and for reference, chapter 11 of 1 Samuel, that's going to be where Saul had actually saved the people of Jabesh Gilead, and one of the good things that he did. And so those people, they didn't forget Saul, and they found out that his body was being desecrated. They go up and retrieve it, and they burn the body, which normally would be more desecration, but I think the general consensus here is that his body had already, decayed and been beyond kind of recognition, and that was probably the most humane thing to do, unfortunately, at that point. So again, so that's about 10 miles from where Saul was actually anointed king, where he ended up dying. There's kind of a little bit of ironic there, but so again, Israel's kind of now on the run. And so this whole country is kind of in a period of despair. The national hope is gone. The adversary has won. They've invaded our cities. But again, God is still working. All right. And God even, again, it's not like God didn't warn them. If we talk about this, God said, okay, you want an earthly king? Here he is. He warned them of the problems of an earthly king, and they still wanted one. And so this is kind of the culmination of that. It's kind of like, again, it's like Samuel saying, I told you this was going to happen. This is nothing new. So that's where they're at right now. God had warned about these things and had these consequences. Any thoughts about, we got one more little section here, but any thoughts about Saul's death to this point? Okay, so now that Saul has died, and we're about out of time, we can kind of get this quickly. Now that Saul has died, and we're going to see a little bit more of David, obviously. We have all of 2 Samuel, but let's take some time to compare. David, you can kind of read these behind me as you're in class, is David was dealt with God. All right, he dealt with his enemy. He talked to God. He dealt with his enemies. He had an interest in God. Everything he did was for the glory of God. He thought about what God would want, and he did everything he could to please God. Even going out of his, almost risking his own life to save Saul on multiple occasions, because that's what he thought God wanted to do. And then he turned to God when times got difficult. But Saul was basically the opposite of every one of those things. He didn't deal with his enemies, which is the main reason for his downfall to begin with. And he was really only interested in stopping David this whole time. It didn't matter what God wanted. He just wanted to kill David. And he didn't turn to God. He turned to a witch, when things got bad for him. So he clearly didn't do things the way God wanted to. So in your life, think about, even when people turn on you, you need to know that God is working for you. And we should pray to God, and we should study the Bible, and we should seek the advice of people that have maybe gone through that situation, or another member or something that can help us get through these situations, and turn to the right people in our lives. Because again, when sin is not properly dealt with, like it wasn't in Saul's life, it just compounds itself, and it makes it worse when it comes back. And you have to you really need to fully commit your life to God. We talked about Romans chapter 12. We don't have time to look there, but that's the chapter where we talk about not repaying evil for evil. And that's what David did, because Saul tried to kill him so many times, and he didn't do that, but that's what God wanted him to do. All right, real quickly, 2 Samuel, it kind of ties into the chapter 1, move into 2 Samuel. It kind of ties into the death of Saul, so I kind of wanted to talk about it real quick, and then we'll pick up next week. But so, again, the beginning part here in verse 1 through verse 10, this guy, he's not very smart. He's an Amalekite, or this guy, and he comes in, he says, he saw Saul die, and he basically claims that he killed Saul, okay? And you got to think in your mind, it's like, all this time that David had a chance to kill Saul, he never did it. And you're going to come here and tell him, you couldn't kill Saul, but I did. You think David's going to respond? He's not going to give you half the kingdom. You know what I'm saying? So,
I don't think he was doing it as in like, look what I did and you couldn't do it. I think he went in there braggadocious.
Yeah.
Was bragging about, look what I may have done. I did this for you.
Yeah. Well, he obviously doesn't react the way he thought he was going to react. Okay, so basically David has him killed just for saying that he did that, even though he didn't actually kill Saul. So David has him killed into verse 11. All right, he tore his clothes, verse 11. Verse 15, go and execute him. He struck him down, so he died. Your blood be on your hand. Because he assumes that he did kill. I mean, as far as he knows, he did kill Saul. And there's something about that point that's interesting, is that you maybe kind of gloss over, is that you can really believe that David truly had nothing to do with Saul's death, because he didn't even know how he died. I mean, he had a clean conscience. This whole time he never killed Saul when he had the chance, and even when he died, he had nothing he could claim that he had nothing to do with it, because he didn't even know how it happened. So
it's also important when we realize the timeline of these events. He's only been in Ziklag. He's returned back from the raid on the Amalekites.
Right.
And he's only been in Ziklag 2 days when he gets this news.
Right. Yeah. All right. So then we see in verse 19 through 27, I encourage you to read that on your own through the rest of the chapter, where David laments here, kind of woe is me kind of thing. And the question again would be, why would you do that? Because this is the same guy that was chasing you and trying to kill you all these times. But again, it just shows David's heart that he really knew that Saul was one of the Lord's anointed. And so we've kind of been over that. But this is not a boo-hoo kind of lament. This is, hey, you've killed the king is dead, and all that. So next week, go through chapter 10. I hope I can get that far. I've already started working on it, and I'm about halfway through, and I'm still in chapter 3. So we'll see how that goes. But there are some battles and things like that from like 5, 6, and through 10 that we can kind of move quickly through. I think we can get into it. So read 2 through 10 next week. It talks about where David becomes the king of Judah as well as Israel later, and some other things. Any final thoughts before we have a prayer? I want to make sure, I didn't mean to rush through that, but I want to make sure we covered that. But again, so now Saul has died, and now the way is kind of cleared for David. And so now from here on, it's going to be, okay, as king, how does he handle things, and the things that come along with being a king, like having a lot of wives and a lot of kids, and the problems that all that brings. We're going to start talking a little bit about his human side there as far as that goes. Okay? Let's have a quick prayer and then we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day and for all the blessings that you give to us, and we're thankful for this study. Again, we're thankful for the life of David, and we're thankful that he always honored you and looked to you and always tried to do everything to please you, and we ask that you help us to take that and apply it to our lives and always look to ways to bring you honor and glory in everything that we do, no matter what, and to always search for that. Thank you again for all those that are present here. Can ask that you continue to be with those that we're thinking of and have on our thoughts and prayers and our minds. We just ask that you continue to bless us, bring us back to the next time. In Jesus' name, amen.